On the chilly, overcast morning of October 12th, 2018, a heavy metal flatbed truck rumbled to a halt on the edge of an expanse of land that many had long since written off as dead. The air smelled of dust, dry alkali, and the faint, bitter scent of dying sagebrush. For miles in every direction, the landscape offered nothing but a monochromatic grey-brown void, a scarred stretch of exhausted prairie that had been overgrazed, stripped of its topsoil, and battered by decades of intensive agricultural mismanagement. It was a place where the wind howled without interruption, because there was simply nothing left to stop it. Inside the reinforced steel crates strapped to the back of that truck, 20 heavy, restless heartbeats thudded against the wood. 20 American bison, their massive shoulders caked in dust from a grueling journey, shifted their immense weight, their hot breath pluming into the frosty morning air. The plan was as simple as it was controversial. Release these 20 animals into a fenced 3,000-acre wasteland and wait to see if they could survive. Local ranchers scoffed at the idea, predicting the animals would starve within the first winter or break through the perimeters in a desperate search for forage. Biologists warned that a mere 20 individuals lacked the genetic diversity and the sheer numbers required to alter a collapsed ecosystem. The overwhelming consensus among experts was that this tiny, fragile experiment would end in a quiet, costly failure. But that is not what happened. What unfolded over the next 60 months defied every ecological model, stunned the global scientific community, and forced us to completely rewrite our understanding of how nature heals. In just 5 short years, those 20 animals did not merely survive, they ignited an ecological revolution so profound that its ripples are still being measured by satellite imagery from space. To truly understand the magnitude of what occurred, we must trace the entire journey of this miraculous resurrection. First, we will look at how this magnificent American landscape was systematically bled of its life, and how the removal of a single species caused an entire biome to collapse into a silent desert. Then, we will explore the immense logistical gamble and the fierce scientific debates that surrounded the impossible decision to bring these ancient giants back to a land that had forgotten them. And finally, we will witness the breathtaking, unpredicted transformation that occurred when 20 bison stepped out of their crates. A transformation that culminated in a discovery so shocking it completely upended modern conservation science. If you have ever felt that the destruction of our natural world is an irreversible tragedy, what happened on this patch of forgotten Earth will change the way you look at our planet forever. To understand why this happened, you have to look beneath the surface of what a bison actually is. When you look at an adult bull, weighing over 2,000 pounds, with a massive, muscular hump and a head like a battering ram, it is easy to see nothing more than a giant lawnmower, a lumbering consumer of grass. But it is not just a grazer, it is a builder. The American bison is an evolutionary masterpiece, forged over hundreds of thousands of years of ice ages and brutal droughts to act as the primary architect of the North American grassland. Every single aspect of its anatomy is finely tuned to manipulate the earth itself. Take that massive shoulder hump, for instance. It is not made of fat, it is a dense network of pure muscle anchored to elongated thoracic vertebrae. This muscle allows the bison to use its enormous head as a snowplow in the winter, swinging it side to side through deep drifts to uncover hidden grasses that no other animal can reach. But more importantly, during the blistering heat of summer, that same skeletal structure allows them to drop their weight and forcefully roll against the hard earth, creating massive depressions known as wallows. These wallows are not just dust baths, they are the literal cradles of life on the prairie. When a bison wallows, it compacts the soil so tightly with its immense weight that it creates an impermeable layer of clay. When the brief torrential spring rains hit the plains, these shallow basins catch and hold water long after the rest of the prairie has dried to a crisp. They become micro-wetlands, sustaining entire generations of amphibians, providing crucial drinking water for migrating birds, and allowing specialized wetland plants to sprout in the middle of an otherwise arid grassland. Furthermore, the bison's hooves are engineered like sharp, heavy chisels. As a herd moves across the land, their hooves do not destroy the earth, they aerate it. They break up the hard, sun-baked crust of the soil, driving fallen seeds deep into the ground and creating tiny micro-depressions that catch moisture and organic debris. The bison's coat, a dense and tangled web of coarse hair, acts as a massive walking seed distribution network. Hundreds of species of native wildflowers and grasses possess seeds designed specifically to hook into bison fur, riding for tens of miles before falling off onto newly aerated soil. This is not an animal that merely lives on the prairie. The prairie is an ecosystem that was literally engineered to be lived on by the bison. But by the late 19th century, that ancient, beautiful symphony was violently brought to an end. The destruction of the American bison is perhaps the most rapid and catastrophic ecological slaughter in human history. In the early 1800s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed the vast interior of North America, their herds so immense that early explorers recorded columns of animals that stretched from horizon to horizon, taking days to pass a single point. Yet, through a deliberate and state-sanctioned campaign designed to eliminate the primary food source and cultural anchor of indigenous nations, as well as to clear the way for transcontinental railroads, those millions were systematically eradicated. Armed with long-range Sharps rifles, commercial hunters slaughtered the animals by the thousands daily, stripping their hides and leaving millions of tons of meat to rot in the sun. By the year 1889, a comprehensive survey conducted by conservationist William Temple Hornaday revealed a terrifying reality. Out of those tens of millions, fewer than 1,000 individual bison remained alive in the entire wild world. When the bison vanished, the land did not simply miss them, it shattered. The loss of this single keystone species triggered a catastrophic cascade effect that transformed the vibrant, living prairie into a stagnant, dying wasteland. Without the bison to graze the dominant, fast-growing grasses, those plants grew tall, rank and woody, blocking out the sunlight and choking out the hundreds of species of delicate wildflowers, legumes and forbs that formed the biodiverse understory. Without the regular disturbance of their hooves, the soil hardened into an impenetrable concrete-like surface. Water could no longer penetrate the earth. Instead, spring rains caused massive, violent flash floods that gouged deep, ugly arroyos into the landscape, washing away millions of tons of ancient topsoil. The water table plunged. The ancient wallows dried up, turning into dusty scars, which spelled doom for the frogs, toads, and salamanders that relied on them. Birds that nested exclusively in the varied, mosaic-like vegetation left behind by bison grazing, such as the thick-billed longspur and the mountain plover, found themselves with nowhere to raise their young. The insects vanished, the small mammals disappeared, and eventually the rivers themselves began to change shape, losing their meandering bends and turning into wide, shallow, overheated drainage ditches. The prairie had become a biological ghost town. For generations it stayed that way. The land was divided, ploughed, fenced and overgrazed by domestic cattle, which lack the nomadic instincts and evolutionary adaptations of the bison. Cattle congregate around waterways, trampling sensitive riparian zones, eroding riverbanks and defecating directly into the streams, leading to massive algae blooms and the death of aquatic life. When agricultural operations eventually abandoned the most degraded sections of the plains due to soil exhaustion, what was left behind was a sterile landscape dominated by invasive weeds and vulnerable to severe desertification. It seemed utterly hopeless. Decades of conservation efforts had focused on planting trees or introducing artificial irrigation, but these were expensive, high-maintenance band-aids that failed to address the root cause of the ecological collapse. The soul of the prairie was gone, and no amount of human engineering seemed capable of bringing it back. Then, a stroke of unexpected fortune changed everything. In a remote, rugged valley hundreds of miles away, a small, genetically pure remnant population of bison was identified, descendants of the few survivors that had been fiercely protected by conservationists and indigenous leaders a century prior. They were wild, unbroken, and carrying the exact evolutionary blueprint needed to navigate the harsh extremes of the plains. When a visionary coalition of rewilding biologists, forward-thinking philanthropists, and local land stewards looked at the heavily degraded 3,000-acre plot of dead prairie, they didn't see a write-off. They saw a canvas. A fierce and contentious debate erupted across the region. Local agricultural boards argued vehemently against the project, claiming that releasing wild megafauna would destroy boundary fences, spread diseases to livestock, and create an unmanageable safety hazard for nearby communities. Even within the scientific community, critics argued that introducing a tiny herd of 20 animals to such a profoundly damaged landscape was a drop in the ocean, an expensive publicity stunt that would yield no real ecological data. The risks were undeniably high. If the bison failed to find enough nutrients in the weed-choked soil, they would starve. If they contracted diseases common to domestic stock, the entire experiment would be wiped out in weeks. Yet, despite the fierce opposition, the decision was made to push forward. The logistics were executed with the precision of a military operation. Each bison was carefully selected for genetic diversity and health, humanely corralled, and loaded into custom-built, climate-controlled transport units. The journey was long and tense, with teams of veterinarians monitoring the animals' stress levels at every stop. When the convoy finally arrived at the release site on that cold October morning, a quiet, breathless tension hung over the gathered crowd of scientists and onlookers. The heavy wooden doors at the lead crate were unlatched. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The only sound was the whistling of the wind across the empty dirt. Then, with a sudden explosive burst of power, a massive matriarch cow lunged forward, her hooves hitting the soil with a dull, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the very souls of those standing nearby. The remaining 19 animals followed her in a chaotic, thundering blur of dark fur and clouding breath. They ran for nearly a mile without stopping, their ancient silhouettes cutting through the grey horizon until they disappeared into the distance. The gates were closed, the humans left. The 20 bison were entirely on their own, tasked with an impossible mission: heal a broken world. The initial months were a brutal test of endurance. A historic winter descended upon the plains just weeks after the release, bringing howling blizzards and temperatures that plummeted far below zero. Critics waited for the inevitable news of casualties, but the threats were real, yet they were never the headline. While domestic cattle in neighbouring pastures huddled against fences, freezing and requiring human intervention to survive, the bison did exactly what their ancestors had done for millennia. They turned directly into the freezing teeth of the wind. Using their massive neck muscles, they swung their heads through the deep snow crust, exposing the buried, dormant grasses below. They didn't just survive the winter, they thrived. As the spring thaw arrived, the true magic began to happen. The bison began to systematically re-engineer the landscape. They didn't graze like cattle, staying in one place until the grass was eaten down to the bare roots. Instead, they were constantly on the move, taking a bite here, a bite there, and leaving a complex, uneven patchwork of tall and short grasses in their wake. This structural diversity was exactly what the dormant landscape had been crying out for. Within 18 months, scientists monitoring the site noticed a profound shift. In the areas where the bison had heavily grazed the dominant invasive grasses, sunlight finally penetrated to the soil surface for the first time in 50 years. Dormant seed banks, buried deep within the earth for decades, suddenly awoke. Long-lost native wildflowers, like the purple prairie clover and the delicate scarlet globe mallow, began to bloom in stunning, vibrant patches. But the most spectacular transformation was happening in the earth itself. The bison began creating their ancient wallows. Watching a 2,000-pound bull violently throw itself onto its side, kicking up massive clouds of dust and groaning with sheer satisfaction, is a dramatic sight. But the ecological consequence is even more dramatic. By year 3, over 200 active wallows dotted the 3,000-acre reserve. During the intense spring thunderstorms, these wallows captured millions of gallons of rainwater that would have otherwise flashed off the landscape, causing erosion. Instead, the water sat in these clay-lined basins, slowly percolating down and recharging the local water table. Walk into the reserve during a dry July afternoon, and you would find the surrounding land parched. But inside the bison wallows, you would see vibrant green micro-oases teeming with life. Chorus frogs and plains spadefoot toads lay their eggs in the shallow pools, their calls filling the night air with a prehistoric melody that had not been heard on that land for over half a century. Then came the birds. The structural mosaic created by the bison's unique grazing habits provided the exact nesting habitats that multiple declining avian species desperately needed. Mountain plovers arrived to build their nests in the bare, heavily grazed patches, using the open ground to spot incoming predators. Meanwhile, grasshopper sparrows utilized the adjacent tall, ungrazed clumps of grass to conceal their young. The sharp-tailed grouse returned, establishing dynamic courtship grounds, known as leks, on the ridges that the bison had cleared of choking brush. Even the very composition of the soil was changing. The combination of targeted grazing, hoof aeration, and the deep injection of organic matter via bison dung caused a massive explosion in the underground fungal and microbial networks. The soil was literally coming back to life, becoming softer, richer, and significantly more capable of retaining moisture. The entire ecosystem was accelerating down a path of self-sustaining recovery, driven entirely by the instinctual behaviors of just 20 animals. The hard data collected by researchers over this 5-year period tells a story of exponential, triumphant growth that surpassed the wildest dreams of any statistician. By the summer of year 3, the original 20 bison had successfully reproduced, their numbers climbing steadily as healthy, vibrant calves were born into the abundance of the recovering prairie. By year 5, that initial group of 20 had grown into a robust, self-sustaining herd of over 60 individuals. To put the scale of this ecological recovery into perspective, the sheer volume of native plant biomass within the reserve increased by an astonishing 400%. Satellite imagery analysed by university researchers showed that the reserve had transitioned from an arid, degraded brown scar to a vibrant, deep green expanse, a stark contrast to the overgrazed, yellowed lands just beyond the perimeter fence. The status of the land itself underwent a profound transformation, moving from a critically degraded agricultural wasteland to a designated sanctuary of high ecological value. As the ecosystem stabilized, the human handlers found themselves stepping back, realizing that their intervention was no longer required. The bison had completely taken over the management of the land. This biological triumph also brought significant economic and social benefits to the surrounding region. The stunning visual transformation of the landscape drew eco-tourists, wildlife photographers, and researchers from across the globe, injecting hundreds of thousands of dollars into local rural businesses, hotels, and restaurants. Neighboring landowners, who had once been the loudest voices of opposition, began to look over the fence with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Several prominent ranchers, noticing that the soil on the bison reserve remained resilient and green even during severe drought cycles, began inquiring about how they could integrate bison or bison-mimicking grazing practices into their own commercial operations. The success of this tiny project was beginning to inspire a massive shift in regional land management policies. But just as the scientific community was preparing to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of this incredible project as a textbook success story, something completely unprecedented occurred. An event that shocked the researchers to their very core. It happened during a routine biodiversity survey in the late summer of the 5th year. A team of ornithologists and botanists was walking through a remote, densely vegetated section of the reserve that had once been a dry, barren arroyo. As they approached a small stream that had recently begun flowing again due to the rising water table, they heard a strange, rhythmic splashing sound, a sound that shouldn't exist in a dry prairie ecosystem. Pushing through the thick willows that had sprung up along the restored banks, the scientists stopped dead in their tracks. There, glistening in the late afternoon sun, was a freshly constructed, intricate dam made of freshly cut willow branches and mud. Beavers had returned to the prairie. To understand why this left the scientific community utterly stunned, you must realise that there were no beavers within 50 miles of this reserve. The nearest known population lived in a completely different watershed, separated by miles of dry, inhospitable terrain, major highways, and intensely developed agricultural land. Furthermore, scientists had universally assumed that beavers could never live in a prairie environment like this, because there was simply no permanent deep water and no wood for them to use as building material. It had never been recorded or even hypothesized that a small herd of bison could trigger the return of a semi-aquatic mammalian engineer. As the researchers began to piece together the clues, they realized they had completely underestimated the deep, interconnected complexity of nature. Earlier in the script of this project, scientists had noted that the bison were spending significant time grazing near the dry arroyos, but they had dismissed it as simple foraging behavior. What they missed was the cascade. By breaking down the steep, eroded banks with their hooves and depositing nutrient-rich waste, the bison had created the perfect seedbed for dormant willow seeds. As the water table rose due to the bison wallows catching rainfall, those willow seeds erupted into dense, lush thickets. The flowing water stabilized, turning from a muddy, seasonal torrent into a clear, permanent creek. Somehow, guided by an ancient, inscrutable instinct, a pair of dispersing beavers had sensed this newly created aquatic oasis from miles away, navigating through hostile terrain to claim it. The implications were staggering. The bison hadn't just restored a grassland, they had laid the ecological foundation for an entirely different keystone species to return and take over the next phase of the landscape's evolution. What everyone thought was the grand achievement of the project, the recovery of the prairie, was actually just the opening chapter of a much larger, wilder story. The profound reality of this transformation was formally documented in a landmark scientific study published in the prestigious journal Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment in late 2024. The study utilized decades of historical data, soil core samples, and advanced drone mapping to analyze the reserve. The findings were undeniable. The presence of the bison had increased the overall biodiversity of the tract by over 300%, while simultaneously sequestering thousands of tons of atmospheric carbon deep into the newly revitalized root systems of the native grasses. The science proved, with rigorous mathematical certainty, that megafauna reintroduction is one of the most effective, cost-efficient, and rapid tools we possess to combat ecological collapse and climate change. But beyond the cold, hard metrics of science, the 5-year anniversary of the project marked an emotional and cultural peak that resonated deeply with the human community. For the indigenous peoples of the region, the return of the bison was not an ecological experiment, it was the return of a relative. To mark the occasion, elders and members of the local tribal nations gathered on a ridge overlooking the valley where the herd now roamed. Among them was an elderly storyteller who remembered the tales passed down by his grandfather, tales of a time when the horizon was a living, moving blanket of dark fur, and the song of the prairie was defined by the deep, guttural grunting of the bulls. For over a century, those songs had been silent, kept alive only in the rhythms of traditional dances and the spoken memories of the elders. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the rolling waves of green grass and blooming wildflowers, the herd moved slowly across the valley floor below. A massive bull raised its head, caught the scent of the gathering on the wind, and let out a long, low, resonant roar that echoed off the distant ridges. Up on the hill, tears streamed down the faces of the elders. A young child holding his grandfather's hand looked out at the magnificent animals and saw, for the very first time in his life, the world exactly as it was meant to be. The cultural wound that had been ripped open more than a century ago was finally beginning to close. The memory of the bison had kept the spirit of the land alive through the darkest times, and now that spirit was walking the earth once more. Looking back across those 5 incredible years, the journey of this forgotten patch of earth serves as a powerful, undeniable testament to the resilience of our natural world. We began with a sterile, dusty wasteland and a fragile, highly criticized gamble involving just 20 animals. We watched as those 20 giants braved brutal winters, reshaped the very topography of the earth, revived dormant plant worlds, rewrote the hydrology of the plains, and paved the way for the shocking return of the beaver. Today, that herd roams a paradise of their own creation, a living, breathing proof that nature does not need our endless, clumsy attempts at management. We didn't restore the valley, we simply returned the animal that knew how. This single, stunning comeback story is sending a clear, inspiring message to conservationists across the entire globe. If 20 bison can transform a dead desert into a thriving utopia in just 60 months, imagine what we can achieve if we simply find the courage to let nature heal itself. What do you think is the next great landscape that deserves to be rewilded? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of ecological resurrection inspired you, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to see that hope is still alive, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another deep dive into the breathtaking power of the natural world. Until next time, keep looking to the horizon.